Hi, I'm Paul Stringfellow, and welcome to this week's edition of Tech Takeaways. I'm joined by my usual co-hosts.
Hi.
Neither of them wanted to tell you their names, but hopefully you know them by now.
They'll be in the right.
And this is part two of a special with our guest, John Hope from Sophos. Hi, John. Welcome back.
Hi, John. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah. I mean, I know we're saying having you back, but literally we've not left the seats, have we, since part one?
Don't spoil the magic for the audience.
I like to pull back the occasional podcast curtain just so people know just how we do this thing.
To be fair, I am wearing the same stuff, so I guess it's reasonably obvious.
People who are regular viewers of the show will realise that normally we're wearing the same clothes for about 5 weeks.
It's a podcast as well, so some audio listeners out there won't even know.
Well, for audio listeners assume we get changed between every episode. It's just the viewing audience who realise that we don't. Anyway, we digress. So in part one, we talked about kind of the cybersecurity landscape a little. We talked about the issues that we still see with ransomware and this kind of multifaceted problem that we get. So on this show, we wanted to talk a little bit more about maybe how we start to deal with that. And actually, between recordings of shows, we did take a breath. Wayne had a great question, so I thought we'd probably share that with you as a good way to start.
Cheers, Paul. Yeah, it was just, again, coming back to some discovery calls that we've done over the past couple of weeks, was a question that was posed to me, was when should I start planning for an incident?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, categorically, you shouldn't be planning for an incident while an incident's happening.
Yes.
That's absolutely the worst time to try and figure out what I should be doing, okay? The shorthand answer, I guess, is now. Really, it's super important to have an incident response plan because, like I said, you don't want to be caught out trying to work it out. So your incident response plan, there's a whole bunch of things you need to be thinking about, and that includes what is the likelihood of getting attacked. And you have to operate with the assumption now that you are going to get hit at some point. Working on the assumption that you're not an interesting target and you won't become a victim is frankly speaking, naive. Okay, so you need to assume that you're going to get hit. And then the question is, what's going to get hit? How does that look, and how do we get back up and running?
So is it important as part of that incident response plan as well to, I mean, we did an episode actually where we talked about kind of cyber resilience, and this is a big part of that. So, but this is not just an incident response plan, is it, around technology? There's a whole bunch of other things you talked about kind of the risk. So what's the impact on a business? Things like how do we communicate with people? Are these all important things to include in?
100%. I'm so glad you said that, because so many people think that writing an incident response plan and figuring out is an IT problem, and it's not, because it involves everybody in the business. And it involves things like, yes, what do we do in terms of lack of productivity? How do we communicate to our customers, to our suppliers? And then how do we get back up and running? Those are just a couple of real simple examples, and it transcends every department and every discipline in the business.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a team effort, isn't it? Because if we look at a cyber incident, for example, that affects IT systems, IT people are going to be focused on getting them back operational. Mm-hmm. But that may not just be the only impact. There may be customers that need to be contacted. Who's going to contact them? It's certainly not going to be the IT guys. They're busy recovering the systems. Who else is involved in that instant response plan, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you're right. It's a team effort. But the problem is with a group of people, if they're all off pulling in their own directions, then actually you don't really progress anywhere. So one of the really important things is who's responsible for which aspect. Everybody cracks on with their own little bit and everyone's working towards the same objectives.
Yeah. So a naive question to ask from me then is, what does planning look like? You said you've got to look at how are you targeted? What's the risk? Is this a plan that you design and you test? You test it annually? What advice could we give to people around planning for a cyber incident?
Okay, so obviously every organisation is different, so you've got to make it bespoke to your own organisation. And we publish free of charge an incident response guide that talks about some of the things you should be thinking about, and that would encompass things like what are my most critical systems, and then in the event of an attack, if that attack is still in progress, maybe you can have a little bit of time to shut down those systems before they become part of the problem. So that's super important. Working out what are my critical assets, and then conversely, what are the important assets I need to get back up and running, in what order? Where is my backup? How do I restore from that? At what point do we do that? At what point do we make sure the backups are clean before we bring them back into production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are all really, really important steps along the way.
And I suppose actually on top of that, this is not just about planning for this. This is about practicing and running some of these scenarios. So, like you said, the time to plan for it is not in the middle of an incident, but of course, the time to test the plan is also not in the middle of the incident. So, have you got any advice in terms of how companies should try and make sure that they're comfortable with an incident response plan way before they have an incident?
Absolutely, yeah. So an incident response plan, first and foremost, is not something that you print off laminate and it's set in stone for all eternity, because IT systems are constantly changing, they're constantly evolving, the business is constantly changing and evolving. So you need to make sure that your incident response plan includes the reality that you're in today. And in your backup, for example, if it's not included the new server that you stood up last week, then that's useless. So it's got to be a living document that you constantly change. But then also, as you rightly point out, you need to be testing it as well. Again, you don't want to find out that actually there are some deficiencies as you're experiencing an incident. So the best thing to do is test it. So, testing the technical measures like backups, making sure that the integrity is there, that it works, the process works effectively, but also making sure that the people know what to do in the event of an incident. It's like the same reason we have fire drills, right? You don't want to be sitting there thinking, where's the fire exit? You ought to have a knee-jerk reaction of, right, the alarm's going off, that's my route out of the building. And an incident response from a cyber perspective should be the same. So it's something you test on a regular basis to find out that it works, and it gets people into the process.
And again, this is not just an IT test, is it? This is actually, I think that the kind of the parallel with things like fire drills is really important, because, I think it's one of those things. Organizations, when we talk about things like incident response plan, maybe sometimes people switch off thinking, oh, it's another IT thing and I don't do technology. But of course, we've already got examples of this in organizations. We have health and safety. Health and safety is a thing that all companies do, and importantly, they do, and they make sure it's right at the top of the things. So when a new starter gets enrolled into a company, of course, they do the health and safety, walk around, they talk to HR. Well, part of that should be, this is what we do around cybersecurity. And the same with incident planning. Like say, we do fire drills. It's no different to do, we've had an incident, let's get the team together, let's look at running the scenario, whatever that scenario might be. And it feels like that's kind of a critical part of getting it right.
Absolutely, it is. It's super important. And you've got to try and make those simulations as realistic as possible. And I'll give you an example of a terrible error that an organisation made when it came to incident response.
We love a terrible error.
Yeah, I don't want to name the unfortunate organisation because it's not fair. It's not fair. But I mean, they had, on the face of it, they'd done everything right. They'd gone through an incident response plan. They'd built it. They'd tested it and made sure it all worked. But that was stored on a server. It was never physically printed out, so you can kind of see where this is going, right?
And it's things like that people don't really think about, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
So go on, where's it going? Because I don't know.
Oh, okay. So the server with the incident response plan got encrypted.
Okay.
And then, so everyone knows there's an incident response plan.
And that was the only copy?
Yeah, that was the only copy. There
Wow.
was no, you want it physically printed out, and you probably want it at home. Because a lot of systems will go down. If you're using voice over IP, which many organizations are using, there's a pretty reasonable chance that even your phone system isn't going to be working. Your email system isn't going to be working. So, how do you contact people? You probably ought to have something like a WhatsApp group or some kind of out-of-band method of communication with key stakeholders, because you cannot assume that anything in the organization is going to be working. I mean, you couldn't really do it in reality, but I guess probably the most effective way of testing your incident response plan is literally going to the main circuit breaker and turning the power off.
We chatting this week, I don't know, was it a conversation we might have had in the past couple of weeks about, there was dialogue between the company that had been hacked and their organisation saying, what should I do? And I intercepted the email and said, just paid a ransomware. You could probably explain that a bit better. Was it?
Oh, no, that was pretty much it. Yeah. So the attackers, and I know we've talked about these kind of war stories before, but the attackers, again, were continuing to carry out reconnaissance while the company talked to their incident response team.
Right.
And they saw the information, well, what should we do? How should we negotiate? And the cybersecurity criminals just came in and said, just pay us the ransom. Stop asking how we should deal with it. And all of those kind of things. I mean, I think it speaks hugely to the complexity of the problem. And I don't think in a kind of a 15-minute show we can do justice to how big a challenge it is. But I think it's important to know that companies like Sophos provide instant response support and instant response teams.
Yep.
There are organizations who work with you in terms of developing your plan and looking at how to do it.
Yeah, so, up front and then executing on it as well. I mean, we talked about resources before and the fact that there's not enough people to run the organization typically on a day-to-day basis, never mind when something does go wrong. So yeah, it is worth mentioning that at Sophos we do offer an incident response service, and that is effectively, whether you're a customer of ours or not, if you experience some kind of cyber incident, then you can call us up and we will work with the victim organization to first and foremost kick the bad guys out and make sure that we're in a healthy state, and then look at how we get back and running as quickly and as effectively as possible. So we have a pot of resources that are available to the unfortunate victims.
So I don't want to do instant response to death, because I know Jason had a question that he wanted to ask kind of before we ran out of time. So Jason, why don't we do that?
Why don't we do that? Yeah, okay. I mean, I just wanted to touch on instant response a little bit, just around kind of the planning. Personally, I don't think that instant response is talked about internally with companies enough. A lot of time we've seen assumptions being made between different departments, so cyber team maybe not talking to the IT operations team, and you ask the cyber guys, what would you do to recover from an incident? And their response is, we'd rely on the ops guys to do it, the IT operations team, because they're fortunate to have an IT operations team. And then you chat to the IT operations team and you pose the same question and they say, well, we'd be pretty stuck. Okay, well, these guys work for the same organization, talk to each other, make that clear, because as soon as that assumption is on place, as in that the assumption is that you're going to get us out of the issue that we're in, and the answer is actually we're not, that just induces so much panic during an incident that it's unnecessary. Organizations, I feel, don't talk, plan, they're not open enough with each other to say, actually, we are probably exposed in these areas, and then realize it, recognize it, and put some kind of plan and effort around that. I think is true to say. John, we spoke on the previous episode about the current state of cybersecurity, kind of the threats that are current now, and we spoke quite a lot about ransomware. How do you and Sophos see that changing over the next, say, 12 months, if you could forecast that far ahead?
Yeah, I mean, that's a long time in cybersecurity, and it's sometimes it's foolhardy to make predictions. But you've put me on the spot. I think realistically, the best we can expect is more ransomware.
Okay.
And that's probably quite a mundane answer, but the reality is that ransomware is the most effective way of getting from victim to cash payout.
Because it's working.
Because it works.
Right,
yeah,
okay.
Absolutely, yeah. The probably the most likely set of evolutions that we'll see is a move towards more blended attacks that include extortion by other means. Okay. So we talked a little about the double dip. That's probably going to become more commonplace. It's already a third on average of ransomware incidents involve some kind of extortion. We'll probably see the rise of more extortion attacks that just have no encryption element to them. But this basic approach of stealing your data or denying access to data and then expecting a payout is the most likely mechanism. We'll probably see the growth of AI being used by the cyber criminals to carry out things like reconnaissance quickly and effectively, and even just mundane and basic tasks like writing phishing emails. If English isn't your first language, then using generative AI to write a phishing email,
a more legitimate looking email.
Exactly. It just knocks out all the basic grammar and punctuation type errors and phrasing errors that we would typically use to spot a phish.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, that kind of, the prevalence of ransomware, because ultimately cyber criminals are in this for the money, and so while that remains a profitable route, I think that continues to be a thing. And it's, like you said, blended attacks. And I think for organizations, that's going to mean that they need to be aware across an increasingly broad spectrum of attack vectors of these are the things people are attacking. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, their goal is to probably deploy some kind of malicious code. Mm-hmm. So they can either do reconnaissance, they can encrypt data, they can exfiltrate information out, and then can extort later on. I think it's certainly going to remain a problem that if we sit down in 12 months' time, I'm pretty sure we won't be going, we've solved ransomware, tick, let's talk about something else. So, well, John, look, this has been great, guys. I think it's been really informative and really helpful, and hopefully it has for viewers at home or wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts. Let's wrap up this episode. And John, I'd just like to say, thanks for joining us. Obviously, you write, present a lot. If people want to find out a little bit more about what you do and can find some of the stuff that you put together, where's a good place to find you?
Probably find me on LinkedIn, I guess, is probably one of the best examples. Yeah. Apart from that, I have a podcast of my own. So check out A Million Questions to Ask podcast, which I like doing that on a weekly basis as well. So not as glamorous as this, I might add, but
who knew other podcasts existed?
Wow.
But it's a show I listen to, and it's a great show. Gives some real detailed insight into kind of step-by-step insight almost into cybersecurity problems. So, well, John, look, thanks for joining us. Jason, Wayne, thanks for being here as well. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? It sounds like you did nothing. Just thanks for being here. Hey, look, if you want to make sure you catch all episodes of Tech Takeaways podcast, then do subscribe. You can subscribe here on YouTube, or if you're a fan of the audio version only, then do subscribe in the podcast homes of your choice. But until next time, thanks for watching.